Hello, everybody. I would love to welcome you to the third annual Judy Marcovitch lecture. It is a great pleasure to have gathered with us here today Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld, who will deliver the annual lecture, as well as Bob Marcovitch and his wife Elise Eplin, and several residents, and also Nancy Vega and Larissa Levitch, who are here to support our program. So I want to mention who our residents are as well. Sylvia Schatz, Janet Cheel, Nancy Kuma, and Raya Drebin. So without further ado, let me introduce Bob Marcovitch, who'll say a few words about his mom and the annual lecture in her memory.
My parents moved to Newbridge when it opened, and when they moved in, my dad was already sick. He had Parkinson's, and my mom spent a lot of time attending to him, but she was a lifelong learner, and she early on started attending classes with Rabbi Judy. And when my dad passed away, she really had a spiritual and religious revival that I think Rabbi Judy witnessed a little bit better than I did. And she always had a very strong intellectual interest in Judaism and Israel. But I think at the end, it was her interest in Torah that really was an emphasis for her. So when she passed away, we decided we wanted to do something in her memory. And a learning event on a yearly basis was something that we wanted to do, and we wanted to mix in some Jewish content, some Torah or some other content. And so that's why we have done this for every year since she's passed, and we intend to do in the future.
Thank you so much, Bob. I think that it's really such a fitting tribute to your mom, who was, as you said, a lifelong learner, learning in so many different realms. She would certainly have loved to be remembered in this way. So thank you. I would like to introduce now Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld. I think of her as my rabbi and role model, but she has many other wonderful attributes. First of all, she is the president of Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. And prior to this appointment, she was the dean of the rabbinical school. She was there during the years that I was studying and was at my ordination. So clearly we have a very special connection. But before her work at Hebrew College, she was widely recognized as a national leader in the Jewish community. For 15 years, she worked as a Hillel rabbi at Tufts University, Yale University, and Harvard University before she came to Hebrew College. And she was the co-editor of two volumes of women's writings on Passover. And in 2015, she was named one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post, and was named to Newsweek's list of top 50 influential rabbis in America. So not wishing to embarrass you with further praise, I'm going to stop here, even though there's so much more I could add. So I would like to bring you Rabbi Sharon Cohen-Anisfeld.
Thank you so much, Judy, Rabbi Ehrlich. Really thank you for that beautiful introduction and for this invitation, which feels so special, an invitation to be with all of you, albeit virtually, talking about really and sharing one of my very favorite topics in the world, which is the topic of contemporary Israeli poetry. And in particular, we'll be looking at some poems in dialogue with the Bible and with traditional texts. And so I also wanted to just say, Bob and Elise, but Bob, in terms of what you said was important to your mother about lifelong learning in general, I hope that this will, in a way, also feel like Torah study to you. It does to me, because in some ways the poets who we'll be looking at, even though they identified as secular poets in terms of sort of the landscape of Israeli life, their poetry is filled with both allusions to the language and images and texts of Jewish tradition, and it's also filled with questions about God, wrestling with God. So questions that are very deep in the tradition as well. And so in some ways, I think it's fair to see this writing as kind of a form of contemporary midrash, contemporary commentary on Torah as it is unfolding in our own time. So thank you so much for making this possible. Thank you for inviting me, Judy. And thank you to those of you who are here on the screen. When Judy and I first talked about this, of course, we're all getting used to this mode of Zoom, but for me, it just makes such a difference to have a few faces in front of me as I'm teaching and making my way through this material. So thank you. And we will also have some time to interact a little bit, and I'd love to hear your questions and comments as we move through this. So I'll also just say a word autobiographically about how I got into studying this material. It starts, I think, somewhat mysteriously before I was born, in that my grandmother, my mother's mother, was a nurse. My grandparents made Aliyah to pre-state Palestine separately and met there. They both went there from Poland and from Ukraine in the late teens and early 20s. My grandmother was a nurse in Palestine. In fact, that's how my grandparents met. My grandfather was one of those who contracted malaria in those years, and she was taking care of him. But the reason I mention this is because she also had the honor of being Chaim Nachman Bialik's private nurse for a period of time in those early years. And it's always been a source of great, I don't have very much yichus, but that's yichus that I am proud of. Chaim Nachman Bialik, of course, is in many ways considered really the grandfather of modern Hebrew poetry, and embodied some of what we're going to be talking about today, actually, which is that he really embodied the straddling of the traditional world of Jewish text and learning, the world of the Beit Midrash, but also the world of early Zionism and the creation, the building of the land, the building of the state, and sort of the struggle between his religious childhood and his increasing involvement with secular Enlightenment ideas and literature, and that was a struggle in his own life, and certainly a struggle that characterized many of that generation, but shows up very richly, actually, in a lot of this writing. So somehow, even though I never knew my grandmother, she passed away before I was born, but I think that in some ways, I trace my interest in this material back to her. And then when I was an undergraduate at Brown University in the late 70s and early 80s, I chose to major in the influence of the Hebrew Bible on American literature. I was very interested, again, in that bridge sort of between the old and the new. And then when I was a junior in college, I studied at Hebrew University for a year, and I had the privilege of taking a class. Actually, to be precise, I often say I didn't know what a privilege it was for me to be taking a class with the extraordinary Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai, who really gave me my introduction to contemporary Israeli poetry that year. And that has become a lifelong love. It's not an area, I haven't done serious academic work in the field, but I have just had the joy of studying it and teaching it for many years, particularly teaching it over the years. Over the last 30 years or so, I have been teaching in Israel in the summer, American Jewish and Israeli teens, and looking at this as kind of a shared literature together with them. So I carry their voices and those conversations with us also into this material. So we'll dive in a minute. We're going to look at a couple of poems. We have 4 poems in the packet that you have for today. I'm not worried about getting to all of them. If we don't get to all of them, that's fine. But they are 4 poems by 3 of my very favorite Israeli writers. And I'll tell you a little bit more about each of them as we go through the poems. The one other thing that feels important to say before we dive in is just a word about what it means for these contemporary writers, again, identified as secular, but clearly asking all the questions that any thinking, feeling human being asks about the meaning of life and about God's place in the world. But anyway, what it means for them to be writing in the Hebrew language. And this is something that is so striking often when you hear contemporary Israeli poets in particular, also novelists, but poets in particular, talk about the way in which writing in the Hebrew language is both such a blessing and such a burden in the way that it carries the echoes and sort of resonances and reverberations of millennia of sacred writing, whether they want it to or not, right? They're writing to an audience that hears certain words and hears certain images and can't help but think of associations from the Bible, from rabbinic literature. That's changing over time, actually, as readers in the Hebrew language may be less familiar with some of those references. And I will say I myself have had the experience of reading a poem and loving it and thinking I understand it, and then discovering, oh my gosh, it's actually referring to a text from Kings that without my even realizing it, and so there is that, but there's a way in which, on the one hand, they are blessed with that sort of rich echo chain, the rich echoes that the Hebrew language carries, and also sometimes feel burdened by that. Because they can't get a word out without people sort of making those connections. So we'll explore a little bit of those connections, but it's also understood to be a very important and distinctive fact about what it means for these secular writers to be writing in this ancient and sacred tongue, there's a way in which the Hebrew language also keeps them tied to the very tradition that they are sometimes questioning, rebelling against, wrestling with. And so it's a very dynamic relationship, and the Hebrew language is sort of at the heart of that relationship. I'll share just one very brief quote that I love from a scholar of this literature, Ruth Cartoon Bloom, who talks about the way not only that the Hebrew language enriches and sort of creates this thickness to the writing itself, these layers of memory in the writing itself, but also the way in which the writing revitalizes our relationship sometimes to those classical texts. So I just wanted to share that because I think that is also part of, I hope, what you'll find. So just very briefly, again, this is Ruth Cartoon Bloom. She describes it this way: the Hebrew poet has a noisy existence. When listening for a word, he is often prey to echoes of remote narratives that cling to the word and are often loud and persistent enough to obscure, if not drown out, its immediate everyday meanings. And then she goes on to say, paradoxically, the very processes of deconstructing and relating to this material in an ironic way sometimes, or a rebellious or critical way, the very processes that these poets use to secularize their language often serve to revive the original scriptural energy. So it's a little bit of a mouthful, but I think it's very important to also hold on to that, to the way in which, again, not only the legacy of this language and this literature comes to bear on the writing and gives it this richness, gives it these echoes, but also the way in which this contemporary writing, this contemporary creative process, as I said earlier, is kind of, it's a midrashic process. It's a process of interpretation and reinterpretation that can revive, as she says, revive the original energy of the sacred scriptures that they are in dialogue with. Okay, let's jump into our first poet and our first poem. And let me share the screen. This poem is called Machvoim in Hebrew, or Hide and Seek. And you'll see it's a fairly short poem. And in some ways you might say deceptively simple. The image that the poet is working with is an image of a child's game of hide and seek. But we'll see where he takes us. The poet here is a poet by the name of Dan Pagis, who was born in Bukovina, Romania, in the early 1920s. He was imprisoned as a child. In the early 1930s. I apologize. He was imprisoned as a child in a concentration camp in the Ukraine, and escaped in 1944, came to Israel himself in 1946, and actually ended up himself becoming a professor of medieval Hebrew literature at Hebrew University. So I should note that he's the only of the authors we're looking at today who is a survivor of the Holocaust. He's also one of the survivors to write, one of the earliest survivors to write and to include sort of a reckoning with his experience during the Shoah in his poetry. First book of poetry that he published, in which he has some poems that deal with themes from the Shoah, was in 1966. And people may know in the 50s and even in the 60s in Israel, there was still quite a bit of stigma attached to survivors in Israel, and quite a bit of silence about their experience. And one of the big turning points in that was the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, when very, very powerfully and dramatically, the prosecuting attorney in that trial made the choice to call 100 witnesses to tell their stories. And even though it really wasn't necessary for the prosecution of Eichmann, it was a very dramatic turning point for Israeli society, which was for the first time really hearing in this very public setting. The whole country stopped to listen to this trial on the radio, in workplaces, in schools. And so it was a very powerful transformation for, in terms of survivors beginning to share more about their stories. And it was really in the years after that Pagis began publishing, and not all of his poetry touches on his experiences in the Shoah, but certainly some of it powerfully does. And I think this one, albeit gently and in an understated way, I think is part of his reckoning with his relationship with God in the aftermath of that experience. So let me read the poem. Since it's a short one, I'll read it in Hebrew and then in English, just so you can hear the sound of the Hebrew. And then we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. Again, the poem is called Machvoim. בחצר אחורית בעולם שיחקנו, הוא ואני. כיסיתי עיניי, התחבא. 1, 2, 3, לא מלפניי, לא מאחוריי, לא בתוכי. מאז אני מחפש כל כך הרבה שנים. אז מה אם אני לא מוצא אותך? צא כבר, צא. אתה רואה שנכנעתי. Hide and seek. In the backyard of the world, we played, him and me. I covered my eyes, he hid. 1, 2, 3. No one in front of me, no one behind me, no one within me. Since then, I've been searching for so many years. So what if I don't find you? Come out already. You can see that I've given up. So the first question I want to ask is actually, are there any association? I've talked about sort of the echoes and the associations in the language and the images. Are there any associations for you that come to mind? And don't be bashful, if you're not sure if they're there, I have a very open approach to the study of poetry, which is let's share how this lands for you and what resonates and what questions come up for you. So that's my first question for you is, are there echoes in the language that you hear that are striking to you, either echoes from biblical texts or rabbinic texts or just other associations? Yes, Sylvia.
It's God hiding his face from me. This is, Panim, I can't find him. And therefore this is, I am desolate. That's a biblical thing that I recall.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, the very theme itself of God hiding God's face is such a deep theme in rabbinic and biblical literature. So already we're in territory that has some history to it and some memory to it. Yes.
Yeah.
Jen.
One of the things that struck me, well, first of all, how alone he felt, how abandoned, how alone he felt, but the shift from third person to first person reminded me. I mean, it's an odd connection, I guess, but it reminded me of the 23rd Psalm.
Yes.
In which there is that shift.
Yes.
And well, I'll leave it there for now.
No, wonderful, wonderful. And it reminds me of that also. And I think there's something about that actually in both cases that contributes to the sense of intimacy of the sense of intimacy with God, even though he's searching for God, even though there's this sense of hiddenness and distance, that move to the second person address, and then at the end, even that kind of pleading second person address of, can't you see, I've already, come out already.
And it reminded me of Moses, wanting to see the face of God, and God saying, hide in the cleft of the rock, and I'll pass by, and you can see my shadow as I pass by, but you can't see me directly.
Right.
I don't have a biblical allusion, but I'm curious about the phrase, I covered my eyes.
Yeah.
That suggests that, I don't know, was he turning away from God even as the Holocaust was happening or before?
Right. It's a wonderful question, and I don't have an easy answer to it. I think that there's one level of the answer is that he's evoking with real precision a child's game of hide and seek, right? Where you innocently cover your eyes while your partner in play goes to hide. And so he's clearly playing with that image here that's where there's sort of a very poignant innocence, right? That he's closing his eyes in play, and the rules of the game have changed on him, right? That he can't find God, and God is not coming out of God's hiding place. That's the plea at the end, is come out already, and the way the game works in Hebrew, by the way, is, this language. You count 1, 2, 3, achad, shtaim, shalosh, and even say those words, not in front of, no one in front of me, no one behind me. He adds the words, no one within me. So, part of what he's doing there is evoking that game. By the way, I also hear in those lines, I don't know if anybody else does, but the language of verse set to a beautiful song about about being surrounded by angels, and each of the angels, in front of me, behind me, above my head, and again he's sort of evoking that. But there's a sense of instead of presence, instead of an enveloping presence, there's a sense of, now I would not say exactly absence, right? There's a difference between hiddenness and absence. And that actually brings me to the second question I wanted to ask you, which is, do you read the poem fundamentally as in a dark way, as a poem about the loss of God's presence in his life? Or do you hear some kind of affirmation by the end of the poem of God's presence, even though it's hidden? And there's no right answer to this. I'm just curious how it lands for you. Yes, Janet, and then
I'm not answering that question, but I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
He says, I covered my eyes. It somehow gives me a little bit of a remez. I don't know if it's a hint or a thought about saying the Shema when you cover your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it may not be, but sometimes it's sort of like an echo of something that the poet put into it.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, Janet, but I think it's a very powerful association. Yeah. Judy, did you want to jump in on that?
I wanted to say that it seems very dark to me because there was no one within me, which is much more powerful than there's nothing within me, more powerful than that there's no one in front of me and no one behind me.
Yeah.
And it's a hint that he's already going to say, you see that I've given up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. I think that is, I think you've taken us to, at least for me, you've taken us to what I see as the darkest, as the lowest point in the poem. That line, no one within me, that emptiness there. I hear him a little bit coming back from that. I'm not saying this is the only way to read it, but I hear him a little bit coming back from that when he says, since then I've been searching, that he somehow did not stop searching. And at the end of the poem, there is still, this goes back to Janet's point, there is still a you that he is addressing in this relationship. There's still a you that he's saying, come out already to. Judy, I think you wanted to say something about this also.
I wanted to say that I see a strong irony between what he says and what he means. Because he says, so what if I don't find you? That would seem like, well, I don't even care if I don't find you. Mm-hmm. Then he says, come out already. Yeah. And that maybe he's not going to find God, but he wants already to see God. He wants, and then he says, you can see I've given up. Yeah. Given up, maybe the act of search, but he hasn't given up, because if he had given up, he wouldn't say, come out already. He wouldn't think there was anyone to come out.
Right.
I think that's the poignancy of it, that he wants to give up, but obviously he hasn't. If he says, come out already, if he thinks that there's a you that he can even talk to, then there's something there.
Right.
It's so hard to find.
Yeah. Exactly. Beautiful. Yeah. And I think he's, moving so, with irony and also with this, as I said, sort of deceptive simplicity, but moving between the imagery of the child's game and the complexity of his own life. And so, right, the language of, I've given up, which might in one context sort of mean one thing, in the context of a child's game of hide and seek is actually, it's wanting to see and be seen, right? Wanting to find and be found, and which is not exactly giving up in the existential sense, right? So
can I say something?
absolutely, yeah.
I think it also beautifully juxtaposes a child's approach with an adult's approach, because when you're a little child, you are bewildered, you can't make sense of things, and to some extent it's a game. You don't know what's happening. When you're an adult, you have a much deeper knowledge of what has happened, and you grapple much more with the depth of why and how and what was it that happened and what is the meaning of it all.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So beautifully said. And
I think there's
go ahead, Sylvia. Yeah.
I think there's an ambivalence here as an adult, the same sort of thing. I've given up. However, if you should come along, that's okay too.
Right.
Yes. So that sense of ambivalence.
Right. And I love that you're both bringing in that. Yeah, I think ambivalence is a wonderful word here, and actually, in a less conscious way, and maybe a simpler way, I think that ambivalence is there even in the way children play hide and seek. I remember so vividly teaching my children to play hide and seek, and how hard it was for them to get the concept of hiding and not saying, I'm over here, sort of I think really children sort of embody for us this very deep ambivalence from the beginning of the part of us that wants to hide, the part of us that wants to be found desperately, and the part of us that wants to find. And so it's all there somehow in these in different layers and sort of recapitulated in different ways at different times in our lives, one might say. So the one other image that an association that hasn't come up, and then we'll move on to a next poem, but I also think he may be evoking the Garden of Eden here. And with this, the courtyard, the sort of backyard of the world, that the Torah's account of the relationship between human beings and God begins with a game of hide and seek, right? It's the very first question that God addresses to humanity, that God addresses to Adam in the garden is, Ayeka, where are you? And Adam says, I was hiding because I was afraid, right? So, and in some ways, there's even, there's a beautiful midrash, we just observed Tisha B'Av not long ago, so beautiful midrash on Lamentations, on the book of Eicha, which begins with that word, Eicha, how solitary, how lonely the city sits. And there's a midrash that makes the connection between the word Eicha in Lamentations and the word Ayeka in the Garden of Eden, punctuated differently, but the same consonants in Hebrew. And the midrash says, in the garden, God is asking man, Ayaka, where are you? And in Echa, in Lamentations, man is asking God, where are you? And, that there's a way, so I think, there's a way in which this poem also sort of takes its place in that, in that questioning that has been going on for as long as human history, which is God and human beings asking each other, where are you? And hopefully continuing to search for each other. So I can see, because people have had so many wonderful comments, I can see we're only going to get to one other poem, and we'll get to it very briefly, but it's fine. I leave you the other poems as a party favor to take home with you and look at when you have a chance. This one that I'm scrolling through is by Yehuda Amichai, but we will look at one by Yehuda Amichai, a short one at the end. And then a poem by Dalia Ravikovich. Who knows, maybe sometime I'll have a chance to come back and we can talk about these together. I'd love the chance to do that. So the last poem, though, is a short poem. It's actually a fragment of a poem from the last book of poems that Yehuda Amichai ever wrote. It's at the end of his life as he was battling cancer. The book is called Patuach, Sagur, Patuach, Open, Closed, Open. And it's really one way I think of, it's a small, very beautiful book, and one way of thinking about it is the whole book is kind of a sustained poetic reflection on the question, what endures, what is enduring, that he was struggling with towards the end of his life. So Amichai, just to say a word about him, he was born in Würzburg in Germany, also in the early 30s. They were the same generation, but he came to Palestine, to Israel, before the war. He was born in a religious Orthodox family, not ultra-Orthodox, but a modern Orthodox family. And so he probably more than any of the other, certainly than any of these other poets, and maybe more than most Israeli poets of his generation, was just steeped in the language of the tradition, and it stayed with him and in his writing throughout his life. So again, this is a fragment from his last book. And maybe again, since it's short, I'll read it in both Hebrew and English, and then we'll just take a couple of minutes to discuss. עקבות רגלי ציפורים בחול אשר על שפת הים, כמו כתב יד שמישהו רשם, לזכור דברים, שמות, מספרים ומקומות. עקבות ציפורים בחול בלילה נשארות גם ביום, אבל לא ראיתי את הציפור שהטביע אותן, כך האלוהים. Bird tracks in the sand by the shore of the sea, like handwriting that someone left to remember words, names, numbers, and places. Bird tracks in the sand at night remain also in the day. But I didn't see the bird that left them there. That's the way it is with God. Yes.
I'm going to do very quickly. I just wanted to tell you, it reminds me of a little bit about a bird, El Hatzipor, and you mentioned Chaim Nachman Bialik. And also, Chana Senish writes about the sand and the sea. Yeah. And I'm not going to go into it because it's very late, so I'll let other people talk.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, yeah. So how does this, I just wanted to juxtapose these two poems actually, because there is a sense of
Hidden.
hiddenness here also, right? But how would you describe the way Amichai is working with that here?
So the tone of this poem feels more mystical to me, more maybe optimistic even a little bit, but a little more about the mysticism around God's presence, whereas the other poem felt not necessarily bitter, but definitely, as you said earlier, a little darker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Uh,
And I love that you're introducing, you introduced the word mystical here, you know. Certainly, it certainly strikes me as mystical in the sense of mystical being connected to mystery, right? There's a sense of actually appreciation for the mystery of how God's presence touches the world. Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
I speak?
Is that you, Nancy? Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
The first poem felt so bleak to me. This poem has a kind of gracious acceptance of God's presence as being shown in ways that are hidden from us at the time. They're traces that we have to put together and make some meaning of after the fact. The tracks in the sand, we may not understand them at the time that they happen. They can happen at night when we don't see them, but they're there, and we put it together in a way that makes a meaning for us, and that's the way it is with God. It's much more of an acknowledgement and an acceptance of God's presence.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a recognition that there is a presence. It isn't a search for a presence.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Judy.
But it's a less personal piece. There's no talking in second person with God. He's accepting that there is a God. Okay, I can't see God, but there's evidence on this seashore, at least, of tracks that say they must have been put there by some, like the handwriting that someone left behind or left for others to see. So he's accepting that there is a God and saying that's the way it is with God. But it is a God that's more distant, more more cosmic God in nature versus a God that he's playing with one-on-one and struggling to find. He's in a peaceful way saying that's the way it is with God. You're not going to see the bird at night, but you know it's there.
Oh my gosh, these are just such fantastic insights, and I think it's Judy, you do such a beautiful job. You know, I always feel a little protective of Pagis, but I think you've just helped articulate the paradox of the poem by Pagis, even though it is definitely darker and there's a deeper questioning there of God's presence. It is so much more intimate. There's so much more intimacy with the very God whose presence he's questioning. So not that I'm also protective of Amichai, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to pit them against each other, but I just, it's such a beautiful articulation of what each is bringing. The other thing that, two other things that strike me about the Amichai. One is just in terms of paradox. Elise, you sort of pointed out for us the sense of mystery around this poem. And I think it's so sort of wonderfully paradoxical that in this poem that is making the most tenuous of claims about the mystery that is God, right? That God is like the tracks of a bird in the sand. What could be more tenuous, fleeting, fragile, but that he ends by saying, Kach Elohim, that's how it is with God. He's daring to actually just make this sort of straightforward, bold claim about the way God works. So it's interesting that at the same time as it's so mysterious, it's kind of this very, very direct assertion of how God works, how God's presence in the world works. The other thing is, I just, since we're playing around a little bit with the language, I just want to make sure we all notice, because it's a little bit lost in the translation. He is kind of gesturing here towards our sacred texts, right? He says, like handwriting that someone left to remember. So he's comparing the tracks in the sand to handwriting also. And then what are the examples that he gives of the handwriting? Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy. Shemot, the book of Exodus, the Hebrew name for the book of Exodus. Misparim, numbers, he's playing around with the, right? Umekomot, I mean, the whole book of Numbers is sort of playing with the census and with these places, all the places we've traveled on our journey. So he's also here just, very subtly gesturing towards all of Torah as also being like bird tracks in the sand, like handwriting that someone left to remember. Somehow that this, this is our sacred texts are writing that God has left like bird tracks in the sand also to remember the story of our relationship with each other. I also just want to call your attention, and then I don't think we're going to have time to look at another poem, so we might have to, just wrap with a couple last comments. But I do want to call your attention to the name of the chapter. So I mentioned the book is called Open, Closed, Open, and each chapter of that book is sort of an extended poem with numbered fragments. So this is one of the numbered fragments in an extended poem that Amichai calls God's Change, Prayers Are Here to Stay. So just think about that for a moment, right? Elohim mitchalfim bashamayim, he writes, God's change up in heaven, hatfilot nisharot la'ad. Prayers are here to stay. Yeah. So there's, there's something also in this whole series, of poems. Remember, I said the whole book, in a way, is a reflection on what lasts, from someone who is facing the end of his life. It's what lasts, and part of his answer to the question is prayers, the human need to pray, the human longing to pray, which maybe is another way of talking about the human search for God, is here to stay, and how we conceive of that God changes, right? Not he's being a little bit provocative, but not that God's self changes, but how we conceive of God will change, keep on changing forever. But for Amichai, that we will continue to reach out to this God in longing and thanks and praise, which is what prayer is at the end of the day. That's here to stay.
Can I say something?
Please,
Yeah.
yes.
So it reminded me of the interpretation of Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, that the reason why you have the repetition of Elohei is that in every age we perceive of God in different ways, and our relationship with God changes from era to era. But our need for a divine presence remains.
Beautiful. I love that. I love that connection. Yes, very, very deeply rooted. It shows up in different places, deeply rooted Hasidic teaching, really, that the reason we repeat in the Amidah prayer, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, is because each had their own, well, you just said it beautifully, each had their own name for God, each had their own relationship with God, each had their own way of seeking God out. In fact, can I say one other thing, and then I'll stop? Maybe we'll end on this note. It's a really beautiful note to end on. But there's a Hasidic teaching that I really love that connects exactly to what you're saying, Nancy, which is, I think it's from the Ma'or Shemesh, who says, this is why God, when Moses says to God at the burning bush, tell me your name. And God says, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, I will be what I will be. What God means, and Moses is asking because Moses says, who shall I tell the people is sending me, right? And what can I tell them is your name? And God says, I will be what I will be, for exactly the reason that you're saying, according to this teaching, that I will be what I will be to each and every one of them in each and every generation. I can't give you one name to tell them because they're each going to have to find their own name for me. They're each going to have to find their own path. So very much along those lines. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that connection. These are wonderful comments, and yeah, I'm sorry to have to stop, but I want to be, respectful of everyone's time.
I want to thank you so much for that beautiful, for the beautiful poems and the beautiful teaching. And it's just so wonderful at how you read it once and then you hear other people's comments and it just gets richer and richer and deeper and more valuable. So thank you for that gift. And I say with confidence, and I'm sure the residents who are on the screen, as well as Bob and Elise, would agree with me, Judy Marcovitch would have loved this. So it was really just very beautiful. So thank you so very much. And thank you to Bob and Elise for this very generous opportunity to honor your mom's memory with a lecture every year. It is so special, and we thank you very much for this opportunity. And thank you to the residents who are with me on the screen, and for those of you who are out there who I hope are smiling and enjoying this wonderful opportunity to think about Hebrew poetry that actually is so real to all of us, even if we don't speak Hebrew. Thank you, Nancy and Larissa, as well, for your support in this. It's been wonderful being here with you all. So, bye, everyone.